I am at the rehearsal dinner for my son Julian's wedding to Isabella Thorne. By accident, I overhear Isabella whispering, "Mom, look. That country old man is still standing there. I told Julian not to let him show up here. Just look at those clothes. He looks like he just walked out of a cow barn. His presence ruins the entire atmosphere of the party." You did not hear it wrong. Those were the words of my future daughter-in-law speaking about her own father-in-law, the night before the wedding. Have you ever heard the sound of your heart breaking? I mean the sound of a father's dignity shattering. It is not loud like thunder. It is silent. It is like the first crack in a sheet of ice, warning of an irreversible collapse. Sometimes that sound echoes in the most luxurious places where people would rather die than let anyone see a trace of poverty. That is exactly what happened to me, Silas, at the Celestial Estate. It was the rehearsal dinner for the wedding of my son Julian and Isabella Thorne. Celestial is not just a mansion. It is a symbol of overwhelming wealth. The air there is thick with the scent of expensive perfume, premium wine, and power. Everything is designed to dominate the senses. And it dominated me. I stood there trying to make myself as small as possible. My hands, the hands that spent an entire lifetime working the dark soil of Georgia, trembled inside the pockets of my worn trousers. I tried to hide them, but the trembling seemed to spread through my whole body. Even the smell of my sweat felt too rough for a place this refined. Then I heard it, her laughter, sharp and cutting. Her voice carried a tone that sliced through every scent of pride I had left. The world around me seemed to collapse. Those words were not just insults. They were knives driven straight into my heart. I did not feel anger, at least not then. I felt shame. A crushing, humiliating shame. I was ashamed that these calloused hands had raised Julian. I was ashamed that the love I gave my son had somehow become a burden to him. I wanted to run. I wanted to run as far away from Celestial as possible, away from the mocking smiles and the suffocating golden lights. I wanted to go back to my land, the place where I know who I am. But I could not move. I stood there frozen in place, like a tree whose roots had been cut. Just as I felt like I might collapse, a firm hand rested on my shoulder. It was Julian. He looked at me, his eyes cold, but filled with determination. Julian whispered, "Stay calm, Dad. I know about it. Tomorrow I will return everything. The humiliation you suffered today and everything I have endured all this time will have a beautiful ending. I mean an ending that will satisfy you and many others." I looked into Julian's eyes. They were no longer the eyes of the little boy I once knew. They were the eyes of a man preparing to enter a battle to defend his dignity. His words were an oath that would shake this entire mansion. I knew this was not just anger. It was a plan, a punishment that had already been prepared. Stay with me, because you will soon discover that this plan is far from simple. In fact, it is something far more terrifying. Welcome back to the channel, Dad's Real Life Revenge. And I am Silas, a farmer. And yes, just as my future daughter-in-law said, I own a cattle farm. This story did not begin under the dazzling chandeliers of the Celestial Estate. It began with the smell of damp soil after rain, and the hands of Elena, my wife. She used to say that a farmer's hands are the most beautiful hands in the world, because they do not know how to lie. They carry the marks of honest labor and the pure love a person has for their family. Julian inherited his mother's calm nature. As we stood in the shadows behind the banquet hall, watching the powerful people raise their glasses in celebration, I saw Julian clench his fists. His eyes were not on the crowd. They were on my trembling hands. My mind drifted back to the old farm. That was the place where Elena took her last breath. She made me promise to hold on to that land, no matter the cost. It was not just land. It was flesh and blood. It was our legacy. But the Thorne family never saw it that way. The first meeting at Baron Thorne's mansion was a perfectly staged performance. They invited us in and poured expensive wines whose names I did not even know. They smiled as if I were an honored guest, as if I were truly an equal in this future marriage between our families. They kept asking questions about everything. For an honest farmer like me, answering truthfully was simply in my nature. And because I did not want my son to feel inferior to the bride's family, I told them about our wide stretches of land. Rural land, yes, but land that would soon have a major development project passing through it. And that is how the conversation shifted to development plans. Baron Thorne asked about the large airport project that was rumored to be opening near my farm. He spoke about growth, about Julian's future. Something about it felt wrong. My instincts whispered that there was a scheme hidden behind those polite smiles. But a father's love for his son has no limits, so I pushed those suspicions aside. My son was different. At first, Isabella had captivated Julian with her perfect appearance. He believed in a beautiful love story and a happy ending, but he soon realized that nothing about it was natural. There was no sudden romance here. It was a plan, a conspiracy, a trap that had been carefully prepared. They used their daughter as bait, and the fish they wanted to catch was his father's farm. They wanted to swallow us whole. What they needed was my signature given gently and willingly. They needed the agreement of the same old man they had just called a country fool. The irony was cruel. My son had given them his sincere affection, and in return he received a bitter betrayal. I looked at Julian. He knew everything. I tried to imagine how my son must have endured all of this, clenching his teeth and waiting for this very day. Make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, because you will not want to miss the moment when justice is finally delivered. But Julian followed an unwritten rule that only people from our countryside understand. Never strike a snake before it has fully revealed itself. He waited. He waited until the Thorn family believed they already held victory in their hands. That was the moment when we would tighten the trap around them. Julian leaned close to my ear, his voice cold as ice. I will make them pay for every word they used to insult you. Every single one. I closed my eyes. The image of Elena appeared in my mind. I knew the battle had only just begun, and the price the Thorn family would pay would be far greater than anything they could ever imagine. Betrayal never comes from enemies. It always comes from the people we allow to sit at our dinner table. That night, Julian handed me a small earpiece. It felt cold like a winter stone. Inside it was the sound of something collapsing. It was a secret recording from Baron Thorn's office. I could hear the faint sound of wine being poured. Isabella's soft laughter. Her voice no longer carried the sweetness she showed in front of Julian. It was sharp and full of poison. Isabella said, "That old man is a fool. He will sign anything his son asks for. Once we secure 21% of the profits from the airport project, we will send him to some remote nursing home in the middle of nowhere." Julian. Oh, he is just a pretty pawn. I used to reach my goal. The blood in my veins felt as if it had frozen. 21%. That was the price they placed on the land soaked with the sweat of my ancestors. That was the price of the fake love they had shown my son. They did not see a family. They only saw numbers and acres of golden land. Baron Thorn burst out laughing. His voice rumbled like thunder. "Excellent, my daughter. Once that farm belongs to us, the Thorn Empire will have nothing left standing in its way. That old man Silas should feel honored to have contributed to our success." I removed the earpiece. My hands were no longer trembling. A strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of a hunter watching his prey step into the trap. Out in the countryside, we have a philosophy about snakes. If you see a snake in your garden, you do not rush to strike the moment you see its tail. It will turn and bite you. Where I come from, we do not strike a snake immediately. We wait until it crawls completely out of its hole. We wait until its weakest point is exposed. And the Thorn family had just crawled out of theirs. Julian looked at me. He did not need to ask how I felt. He already knew. We share the same blood, the same pain, and the same plan. Julian said, "They think we are fools. They think your honesty is weakness. They are wrong." I tightened my grip around the earpiece in my palm. Yes, they made a terrible mistake when they underestimated a man who has nothing left to lose, except his dignity. They believe they are the hunters, but they do not realize that they are the prey. I want to ask you something. Do you think the Sterling family deserves a second chance, or is public punishment the price they must pay? Comment 1, if you believe justice must be carried out. Comment 2, if you think they deserve another chance. Our silence was not surrender. It was preparation. Every insult, every scheme to seize our land had been recorded. We were gathering firewood for a great blaze, a fire that would burn away the arrogance of the celestial estate. Isabella was still trying on her wedding dress. Baron Thorn was still calculating profits. They could not hear the footsteps of justice approaching. Those footsteps are quiet, but they never stop. In the darkness of a small apartment in the city, Victor moved his fingers across the keyboard. He was a genius with audiovisual systems, and more importantly, he was Julian's most loyal friend. Victor looked up. The glow from the computer screen reflected in his eyes with a cold blue light. He nodded. Everything was ready. The projection system of the celestial estate was now in our hands. Baron Thorn believed he owned the building, but tomorrow Julian and Victor would be the ones controlling the stage. The emotional bomb had already been built. It was not made of explosives. It was made of truth. The video Isabella prepared to showcase their romantic love story would become a spectacular deception. We had woven into it the darkest truths. Secret recordings. Images of contempt. Everything would be magnified on the giant screen in front of the most powerful people in the city. I returned to the farm one last time before the ceremony. I stood in front of Elena's grave. The wind moved through the dry fields carrying the scent of memory. I placed my calloused hand on the cold stone. I promised her that this legacy would never fall into the hands of deceivers. People say that an old lion grows weak. They believe I have lost my fangs and claws. But they forget one thing. An old lion still knows where his claws are. And more importantly, he has a grown lion beside him strong enough to fight. He simply waits for the perfect moment to deliver the final strike. I was no longer afraid. The humiliation from the banquet hall had turned into a hard iron-like strength inside me. Julian stood behind me. He said nothing. He simply stared toward the horizon. He had sacrificed a great deal to carry out this plan. He had played the role of a man blinded by love, a puppet dancing under Isabella's control. But tomorrow that mask would finally be removed. Patience was our sharpest weapon. We had infiltrated deep inside the enemy. We knew every shadow hidden inside their scheme. Isabella was still dreaming of a wedding of the century. She was still dreaming about the enormous fortune hidden within my land. She did not realize she was building a castle on sand. And the tide was rising. I looked at the wildflowers trembling in the wind above Elena's grave. Tomorrow, justice would be delivered. Not through violence, but through exposure. Those who believed themselves superior would be forced to kneel before the truth they tried so hard to hide. Tonight was the final night of silence. Tomorrow, the echo of truth would shake the entire celestial estate. I felt the cold steel of the old watch on my wrist. Time was moving toward justice. Every passing second was one step closer to the day of judgment for the Thorn family. Everything had been prepared. There would be no retreat, no mercy, only the naked truth and the price that must be paid for boundless greed. If you have followed this story all the way to this moment, then I know you feel it too. The anger on behalf of those who are oppressed and treated as if they are nothing. Help us with one small and quick action. Subscribe. There are still many voices that need to be heard. The celestial estate shone brilliantly under the sunlight. Thousands of white roses lined the pathway, creating an illusion of purity. But I knew better. Behind that sweet fragrance was the smell of decay. Isabella walked down the red carpet. Her magnificent wedding dress glittered beneath the chandeliers. She smiled at the guests. It was the smile of someone who believed she already held victory in her hands. Baron Thorn stood proudly beside her, wearing a look of smug satisfaction. He glanced at me with pity in his eyes. To him, I was nothing more than a dirty country old man standing in a room of elegance. The ceremony began. The priest spoke about love and unity. Julian stood there, his face frighteningly calm. He looked at Isabella as if he were looking at a ghost. Then came the most important moment. The priest asked Julian if he would take Isabella as his wife. Julian stepped back. He picked up the microphone. His voice echoed through the church. Before I answer, there's something I want everyone to see. The entire room fell silent. Isabella's face turned pale. Baron Thorn rose abruptly from his seat. The large screen behind them flickered to life. Victor had activated the bomb. The video was not filled with romantic memories. It showed the darkest moments instead. Isabella's voice rang clearly through the powerful sound system. That old man is a fool. We will send him to a nursing home in the middle of nowhere. Julian is just a pawn. And there are many vulnerable families we have already tricked and stripped of their property. The hall erupted in whispers. The powerful guests began pointing and murmuring. Isabella collapsed in the middle of the aisle. Her expensive wedding dress now looked like a cocoon trapping a liar. Her world crumbled right in front of my eyes. Baron Thorn shouted, demanding the screen be shut off. But Victor had locked the entire system. No one could stop the truth. At that exact moment, the grand doors of the estate burst open. Dominic Vance stepped inside, carrying a thick stack of documents. The presence of the famous prosecutor froze the entire room. Dominic Vance spoke clearly and firmly. "Baron Thorne, Isabella Thorne, I have an arrest warrant for both of you for fraud, property seizure schemes, and falsification of documents related to the airport development project." Isabella looked at Julian with eyes filled with hatred and desperate pleading. But Julian did not look at her. He walked straight to me. He took my calloused hand, the same hand she once called filthy. Julian whispered softly, "I promised you, Dad. Justice has arrived." I looked at Baron Thorne. The powerful man from just moments ago now appeared small and pathetic. The glittering illusion of celestial had vanished, leaving only the naked truth of criminals exposed. Even the white roses seemed to wilt instantly. My silence was no longer humiliation. It was peace. I had kept my promise to Elena. That land would remain ours forever. The dignity of a father had been restored, and the price the Thorne family would pay was only just beginning. The cold steel handcuffs were already waiting for them behind the doors. The sharp click of cold steel echoed through the silent halls of the estate. It was the sound of an ending. The handcuffs snapped shut around Baron Thorne's wrists. The collapse of an empire built on lies happened quietly. Isabella watched her father being led away, her eyes empty. Her pure white wedding dress now looked painfully out of place among the blue uniforms of the police. The Thorne family had lost, not because they lacked money, but because they lacked humanity. Baron received a sentence of 12 years in prison. Isabella received 10. That was the price of their boundless greed. Their assets were frozen. The lands they had seized were returned to the poor farmers they had taken them from. Justice is not only written in legal documents. Justice is also the restoration of sweat and tears that were stolen. I stood there watching them being taken away. I did not feel joy. I felt relief. The crushing weight that had rested on my shoulders for so long was finally gone. My dignity, the very thing they had tried to trample, had been restored in the exact place where they planned to execute their final scheme. Protecting what belongs to you is not selfish. It is dignity. Never be afraid to stand up for the truth, no matter how powerful or wealthy your opponent may be. We returned to the farm. Golden sunlight stretched across the fields of Georgia. The wind carried the scent of soil and dry grass. It was the smell of freedom. Julian walked beside me. He had shed the appearance of a city gentleman. Once again he was simply my son, the boy who grew up on this land. Clara was waiting for us there. She was not wearing expensive clothes. She wore a simple shirt, and her eyes shone with sincerity. Clara loved this land for its true value. She loved the calluses on my hands because she understood what they represented. Julian had found real happiness, not in grand ballrooms, but in the quiet peace of the soul. I stood in front of Elena's grave. I whispered to her that everything was finally right again. The legacy of our family remained intact. Our grandchildren would grow up here. They would learn how to love the land and how to keep their backbones strong against temptation. Life sometimes pushes you to the edge. There are moments when you may feel like nothing more than a dirty old countryman in the eyes of the world. But remember this: true strength lies in truth and patience. We defeated the snakes by waiting for them to crawl out of their holes. We protected our home with love and unity. Night began to fall. The oil lamp inside the small wooden house was lit. The sound of Julian and Clara laughing drifted from the porch. I sat down in my familiar rocking chair and looked toward the horizon. A new chapter had begun. A chapter of healing and abundant harvests. Justice had been served and peace had finally returned. After the storm silence settled over the farm, the noise of the celestial estate had become nothing more than broken fragments of memory. I stood alone in the field where every inch of soil still carried Elena's breath. A feeling of relief slowly spread through my body. Yet deep inside me, one question lingered. Did revenge truly bring peace? I looked down at my hands. They were still rough, still marked with the scars of time, but they no longer trembled. The humiliation was gone. In its place was a quiet pride. I had kept my backbone straight. I did not let the dirty money of the Thorne family bend my will. Julian stepped out from the porch. He carried 2 cups of hot tea in his hands. He looked at me with understanding in his eyes. He had played his role for far too long. He had buried his disgust just to reach the final moment. Now his face had softened. The cold sharpness was gone. Only the warmth of a son returning home remained. Julian said, "Dad, everything is truly over now. Attorney Vance just called. The entire airport project has been revised. Our farm will be preserved as a cultural heritage site for the region." I nodded. It was the best news I had ever heard. Not because of property value, but because Elena's legacy would live forever. Those who believed money could buy everything had learned the most expensive lesson of their lives. Clara was helping Julian clean up the old kitchen. The sound of dishes clinking together filled the house with a quiet joy. It reminded me of the old days when Elena was still here. Life was beginning to grow again on this land. After all the schemes and deception, sincere love was the only thing that remained. I sat down on the worn wooden chair and looked toward the farm gate. The police cars and reporters had left long ago. Only the rustling of wind through the trees remained. Baron Thorn and Isabella were probably learning to live with the gray walls of a prison cell by now. They would have plenty of time to reflect on their arrogance. A father's revenge is not destruction. It is restoration. The restoration of values that were almost forgotten. The restoration of faith in justice. I had shown Julian that sometimes silence and patience are stronger than 1,000 angry words. Night slowly fell. The stars shimmered across the Georgia sky. I closed my eyes and breathed in the warmth of the earth. A long journey had come to an end. I had kept my promise, and tomorrow when the sun rises I will begin working this land again, with a heart that is finally free. The celestial estate on the morning after the arrests looked like a dead stone monster. The white roses that had bloomed so brightly the day before were now wilted, their petals scattered across the red carpet like belated tears. I stood in front of the grand hall watching the staff rush to clean up the remains of a wedding that never happened. Dominic Vance walked over to me. He handed me a stack of documents stamped with the red seal of the court. Inside was the decision canceling every fraudulent agreement Baron Thorn had forced me to sign. Justice does not arrive through words alone. It arrives through solid evidence, the kind Julian and Victor had worked so hard to gather. Isabella had tried to call Julian from her cell, but my son did not answer. He had nothing left to say to a person who had treated his father's dignity like garbage. Julian stood beside me, and his face now carried a strange sense of relief. He had taken off the expensive suit and replaced it with the old jacket he used to wear while working on the farm. We got into the car. Behind us the celestial estate slowly faded into the distance. That castle of greed had become nothing more than a symbol of collapse. Baron Thorn now had 12 years to reflect on the value of the land he tried to steal. Isabella had 10 years to learn the difference between a father and a target for humiliation. The road home felt shorter than before. The smell of the city, thick with smoke and deception, gradually gave way to the scent of wild grass and damp soil. When the farm gate appeared, I saw Clara waiting for us. She did not need long explanations. Her eyes said everything. She loved Julian not because of the fortune he might inherit, but because he was a man brave enough to defend his family. I walked behind the cattle barn, the same place. Isabella once mocked, saying I looked like I had just stepped out of it. I took a deep breath. The scent of nature. The scent of honest living. It was sweeter than any expensive perfume in the halls of Celestial. I ran my hand across the wooden fence. It was rough and worn just like my life. But it was strong. Julian stepped closer. He looked out at the wide fields waiting for the next harvest. "Dad," he said in a low, warm voice, "we will rebuild everything. Starting from this land." I smiled. A real smile after so many bitter days. I knew Elena was watching us from somewhere beyond the clouds. She would be proud. Not because we had defeated an empire, but because we had refused to let them corrupt our souls. The greatest revenge is not sending your enemies to prison. The greatest revenge is living a happy life and standing tall on the very land they tried to steal. And that is exactly what we did. The sun slowly sank behind the trees. A soft orange light spread across the farm. A dark chapter had closed. We walked into the house where Clara had already prepared a simple dinner. Laughter began to fill the air. Peace had truly returned to this home. A peace built on truth and resilience. In the days that followed, news about the fall of the Thorn family flooded the headlines. But here on the farm we did not care about sensational stories. We cared about bringing new life back to the soil. Julian spent most of his time on the old tractor. He worked with a fierce determination, as if trying to wash away every trace of the city. Watching my son out in the fields, I saw a reflection of myself 30 years ago, a man who loved the land and believed in the dignity of honest labor. Clara brought new life into the house. She planted fresh rose bushes in front of the porch. But they were not the white roses from the celestial estate. They were wild roses, strong and bright beneath the sun and wind. She told me that true beauty does not need luxury to protect it. It only needs sincerity, and hands willing to care for it. I sat at the wooden table, flipping through Elena's old letters. A quiet sadness lingered in my heart, but it no longer carried bitterness. I had kept my promise. This land was not just property. It was a witness to our love. It was where Julian grew up, and where our legacy would continue. Baron Thorn had tried to send a request for leniency from prison. He spoke about the contributions his family had made to the city. He claimed there had been confusion in the paperwork, but the truth cannot be twisted by late excuses. Isabella's recording had closed the door on every lie. Isabella was no better off. She could not adapt to a life without servants or silk dresses. The people who once praised her at Celestial now looked at her as if she were a stain. For someone who valued appearances above all else, that was the harshest punishment imaginable. Sometimes I still remember the moment I stood in that grand hall surrounded by luxury while being looked down upon. The feeling of humiliation still lingers somewhere in my memory, but now it no longer hurts. It has become a reminder that a person's worth is not measured by the clothes they wear or the hotels they stand in. It is measured by what they are willing to defend when everything is threatened. Julian walked into the house, sweat on his brow but his eyes shining brightly. He placed a handful of soil on the table. The earth was dark, rich, and full of promise. "Look at this, Dad," he said. "Next season we are going to have the biggest harvest we have ever had." I looked at that handful of soil and then at my son, and I realized that the plan for revenge had actually been a journey to rediscover ourselves. We lost our peace for a short time, but in return we gained a freedom that would last forever. I want to say something to anyone who is suffering under injustice. Do not give up. The truth may move slowly, but it always arrives at the right moment. Arrogant people may build towering castles, but if their foundation is built on lies, it will collapse from a single wind of truth. That evening we sat together beneath the stars. There was no champagne, no orchestra, only the sound of crickets and the sweet scent of clover grass. Julian held Clara's hand. I looked up at the sky and smiled. "Elena, we won. Not with power, but with the hearts of farmers. The land is still here. We are still here. And dignity has finally been returned to where it belongs." Golden sunlight poured across the fields of Georgia. It was nothing like the harsh glitter of the chandeliers at the Celestial estate. This light was gentle like the embrace of family. I stood on the porch watching Julian and Clara walk together along the fence line. Their laughter was clear and bright, blending into the peaceful morning air. That was the real victory. Justice was not only the sentences given to the Thorn family. Justice was the cold, metallic click of handcuffs around Baron and Isabella's wrists. It was the collapse of an empire built on deception. But for me, justice was also seeing Julian finally lay down the weight of hatred. My son no longer had to perform a role. He no longer had to smile at people who looked down on his father. Baron Thorn and Isabella now faced the reality behind prison bars. 12 years and 10 years. Long enough to learn that wealth cannot buy respect. Their assets were auctioned to compensate the farming families they had deceived. It was a late form of justice, but a necessary one. I stepped down the wooden stairs. My boots touched the cool earth. These calloused hands were once called filthy by Isabella. Yet they were the same hands that protected Elena's legacy. The same hands that raised Julian into an honorable man. I no longer felt ashamed of the scars or the smell of sweat. They were the medals of an honest life. Julian walked over and handed me my old hat. He looked at me with quiet pride. "Dad," he said softly, "everything is starting to grow again." He was right. Not only the seeds in the soil, but a new future for our family. Julian and Clara would build their home right here, where love was never a tool for profit. I looked toward the distant horizon. For a moment, it felt as if Elena's presence drifted through the tall grass, swaying in the wind. I had kept my promise. The land remained ours. The honor of a father had been restored. Our revenge did not end in destruction. but in renewal. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it moved you, join our community by pressing like and subscribing so you can hear more real, raw stories about family and life. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. The wind moved gently across the fields, carrying the scent of freedom. I took a deep breath. My chest no longer felt heavy like it did on that night inside the grand mansion. I sat down in my old rocking chair, closed my eyes, and listened to the quiet rhythm of life. Everything had returned to where it belonged. The sunlight was still golden. The earth was still generous. And we were still standing on our own 2 feet. Peace had truly come home to the farm.